The new Symmetra went live into the competitive playlist yesterday, and superstar streamer Seagull showed off a lot of the capabilities that she has. We're going to go over all aspects of her kit here today, myth bust some misconceptions about her weapon and the proper way to use it, how to get the most out of the teleporter, her sentries, and her ultimate. But first, I have to put a bit of a disclaimer at the start of this video. Symmetra always was, and definitely still is, a niche hero. Consult your doctor before taking Symmetra. Luckily though, because her niche is now surrounding team mobility, she's definitely more viable than she used to be in every single way. But still, just be careful and be respectful. The games we're showing today were taken from day one, so there wasn't a lot of ladder experience on how to counter her, and even with that, Seagull didn't win that many games. That's only going to get worse as time goes on, I think, but it is important to know how to utilize the tactics yourself or synergize with a Symmetra on your team if it is to happen. So let's get right into how to play Symmetra. First thing I want to point out is that many people were concerned that her weapon is weaker, but it actually is a lot stronger. But you have to reinvent how you think about her playstyle in order to get the most out of her new damaging capabilities. Old Sim used to be able to pounce on an unsuspecting foe, lock onto them, and kill them rather quickly if they weren't able to react with a few swift headshots. But now her primary fire is in a much different place. It isn't what you want to use in duels at all. Instead, it's a bit more of a niche primary fire, similar to how May's is. Symmetra, like May, wants to be using her range spam way more than her primary fire and only look for the specific opportunities for where the primary fire is going to be useful. And in short, what you want to look out for is moments where there's a lot of shields in your way, or a fight that's obviously going to be extending out for a while. If everyone's all spread out and you have to go take a quick duel, definitely charge up your alternate fire to burst them down quick. However, if you're in one of those attrition battles where there's a lot of healing and a lot of barriers in the way, cooking up your primary fire to get to the third level of charge makes her one of the most damaging characters in the entire game. Now granted, the primary beam is ineffective if you can't reach that, but that's sort of the trade-off with it. Most of the time you want to use the alt fire, but if you do reach that level 3 charge, it's going to carry the entire team fight. So balance-wise, there's no way they really can make the primary beam any better because it already has the potential to do outrageous things and just melt everything in front of her. Now with that out of the way, the more important aspect of her weapon is her alternate Orb Fire, which is one of the most effective projectiles in the game. Yeah, not enough has been said about this. This projectile is incredible. On direct impact, it does as much as a fire rocket. It's a bigger projectile than that and has more splash radius, more similar to like a Zarya alternate fire where it just explodes on the ground and hits everything around. Charging up one of these bad boys to sneak up onto an unsuspecting foe to either direct hit them or explode it on the ground chunks them down so severely that you're basically going to win that duel. So the playstyle that old Sim players are going to want to emulate from what they used prior just takes a little bit of projectile aim, and that's kind of where you want to fit her damage into. Obviously, just like Junkrat and Pharah, spamming projectiles down chokes is going to be very effective, it's quite obvious, but where she starts to look a bit more like a skilled DPS character is how you hit these orbs in the mid-fight, predicting their path and oftentimes trying to go for the splash damage to get consistent damage out. Seagull's very good at this, obviously. He's one of the best projectile players in the world, so he's going to be able to hit the hard shots with her as well, but I think most of the time, the easy shots that most of us will need to be able to hit on slow-moving targets and tanks are going to be quite reliable. I don't think the aim of it is too tricky, as long as you understand how you want to get yourself into the fight to be able to do your damage. So using your teleporter to flank, to get behind someone, or get onto the high ground to shell damage down onto your enemy, just like a Pharah would want to, is what you're going to be wanting to go for. And when you do that, you'll start to notice that she definitely is a DPS now. Very close in feel to the damage output that a character like Junkrat can have, who most of the time wants to avoid the fight and just find angles to get their really large projectiles into play. But once in a while, you will need to bail yourself out of a duel. Let's take a look at how Seagull handles this 1v1 against this enemy Genji. The Genji's harassing his high ground position, and remember, because Seagull has shield health, as soon as he's ever going to duck away, he can start to regenerate that back. So he's already at full health again by the time the Genji comes back, sets up his turrets defensively, so the Genji has to parry back, keeping in mind he doesn't have his own self-heal, putting Seagull kind of up in this fight right now, spamming projectiles projectiles at his feet in order to deny most of the surface area of the ground of where he's wanting to stand, getting some reliable damage onto him. Now, Genji very nearly brings this duel back with a few shurikens landing and a swift strike, but because the swift strike misses, this reflect still does nothing against the sim beam, and Seagull ends up winning. Okay, now once you're comfortable laying down the hurt with Symmetra, using your teleporter to get yourself in and out of combat, it's time to start thinking of her higher tier applications in teamwork. Because up until this point, most of what else she does is sort of just a weaker version of other spam characters. The real reason why you want to take Symmetra is what she can do with teleport. We're going to explain the premise of the different characters and why they're strong with teleporter, and then give some examples of Seagull pulling this off in game. Most players still don't really understand the strength of high ground and what it does, but you'll learn to once you find Symmetra teleporting characters to spots they really should never get to at all, or more reliably than they ever could before. Ana, Bastion, Torbjorn, Orisa, characters whose mobility is abysmal, but the power they bring is strong, all of a sudden are a match made in heaven with Symmetra's teleporter, and it actually turns these characters that otherwise are incredibly exploitable due to their lack of mobility to finally have mobility, gifted from the Symmetra teleporter. In fact, I'd go so far to say is that if you're running Symmetra, you probably do want to get really greedy with some of these immobile characters to get the most use out of getting them into either flank spots, high ground, whatever, because a lot of other characters don't benefit that much from the telly actually, because they typically already have ways to get to those places anyway. You're going to see the biggest bang for your buck when you start teleporting Anas to the high ground, Bastion on a flank, or probably what I think is the most reliable strategy, bouncing the bunker. You also could call it bouncing the Bastion. This is a term that I just made up, but I think it actually makes a lot of sense for how you're able to get a team that's supposed to be completely immobile to bounce them across the map. This looks even more powerful on a map like Anubis A, which has a natural high ground that Orisa can just go to and fro to, bouncing from either high ground position, creating a very difficult proposition for the enemy to deal with, because how do you push through this when the enemy can at any point teleport behind you? Seagull was even practicing with Mendo, queued up with him, finding characters that are going to see the biggest success with this. You take a character like Reaper, who sure has his own shadow step, but it's so slow that it never can be used in combat. Well now, surprise, Reaper onto the high ground, taking out a Pharah like it ain't nothing. All of a sudden, you put these characters together and you can get them into whatever position they need quite fluidly. Now for my money, Orisa is the #1 tank you want to utilize with Symmetra. A lot of people are still running Rein, but I think Orisa is the key because she always has value at medium range, whereas part of Rein's appeal is that he moves his shield himself. He can push into locations, and then of course, in some circumstances, brawl. But if you want to be playing keep away, the teleporter is the best way to do that, and that's what Orisa wants to do anyway. And normally when she wants to reposition, she has to stop shooting, she has to retreat, probably getting out of range of her barrier, which is most important. The biggest problem of the shield is that you have to put it in one location, and it can't really move, nor can Orisa really move from it without being at a big disadvantage. Well, you do yourself some bunker bouncing, and all of a sudden, you just get all of those cooldowns into an entirely new spot. New high ground there, new high ground there. I'm fairly certain this is going to be the biggest tank synergy that is going to get utilized, and allows you to kind of play Overwatch like a RTS game where you kind of get your army in one position and then move them to another. And not to mention, Symmetra's most effective weapon, her Orb Fire, also synergizes with Orisa Halt. And this might not be completely obvious right away, but getting Halt into aggressive spots is actually incredible. Normally, Orisa is standing at a distance waiting for a Halt opportunity to open up, but with the teleporter, you can get Orisa into the backline, basically, to nab a Halt onto the enemy. That's incredibly strong. Usually, there's a bunch of tanks in the way where the Halt can't find a squishy target, but when you use teleport, Orisa all of a sudden becomes a bit more of a aggressive tank. Now that's what I think is the most viable strategy, but one step further, you also can think of how to get Bastion to be bounced from spot to spot, make him very difficult to shut down, because of course he can teleport while in turret form, which is really scary. Watch how Mendo is allowed to teleport right into the front line in a spot where frankly he would normally be really scared to be set up, way too close for comfort. Rein could even maybe come and pin him here, lay in a ton of damage. Oh, they're too close, teleport away. Now he's safe, and the damage output that we have got out of the Bastion here is massive because we're allowed to use the teleporter to min-max his Gatling gun, getting it into position to do massive damage and then escape it it the heck out of there. Now, like I said at the beginning of the video, this is kind of a goofy way to play the game, but I'm telling you, if you go in with friends in order to try to communicate these things, you will take people off guard. They are not used to Orb turrets getting teleported behind them or a bastion that they can't lock down. It's an entirely new way to play the game and a whole lot of fun when you can get it to work. It's this area with the teleporter that's really going to be where Symmetra lives and dies. If you're able to use the map to teleport obnoxiously from place to place and get some really scary characters to places that they normally never can touch very freely to aggressively go in and come back safely, that's where teleporter and Symmetra look really good. But a lot of the other times, this isn't going to be very good, so use with caution, of course. And one last thing before I forget about the teleporter, you can use it to escape Graviton Surge. The problem is a lot of these team fights are oftentimes chaotic. They're throwing a lot of ultimates at you, so you probably need to know they have Grav and be ready to set the teleport very early before the follow-up can come, and be sure to set it down close enough so that your teammates can interact with it so enough of them can actually escape the Grav. At the very least, those matchmaking telegraphed ranged Grav setups are going to be quite easy to outposition with the telly, but in the chaos of things, more often than not, if they're pressing up on you and are surrounding you anyway, this will be quite a difficult trick to pull off, but definitely something you want to think about if you're playing up against Zarya. Now let's move on to talking about her Sentry Turrets, which are fewer in number, but buffed up and a lot stronger. With a bigger range and more effectiveness, you'll often find Seagull placing them at high up angles. I really love what he does against the enemy Pharah here on Anubis. Pharah already was kind of a difficult pick on attack there. Usually only can pick her if the enemy is really weak to Pharah, because there's just too much high ground for the enemy to exploit near where your flying paths are, and you can't really go high enough to avoid it, and these sentry placements really abuse that fact. Often I notice that Seagull will put the sentries quite high because that's where they'll be most difficult for your opponent to turn at a high angle in order to come destroy them, but also you don't want them easily destroyed. You don't really want to be wasting time trying to lay down your sentries. You kind of want to put them in a good zoning spot and then get back to that right click action, because that's where you're going to get most of her reliable damage out. Of course, you can do cheeky things like throw a sentry behind your enemy, but if they do turn to destroy it, I think you almost always were better off just trying to do your main attack, your orb spam, instead. But especially during reloads and when the situation calls for it, feel free to try to scatter them across the battlefield to try to place little traps that are going to annoy and pull the attention away from your opponent mid-fight. I'm sure there's going to be videos on YouTube dedicated entirely to Symmetra nest spots. A place like this into the bounce pad where you know characters are going to want to run is a good place to trap them, but I would say you probably want to keep moving them in order to find new locations to surprise your enemy. Over a doorway or a choke is always pretty good as well. Reinhardt never wants to walk through a choke and start getting zapped in the back, slowed down. It's really obnoxious, and help you can control that engagement a bit. Now, there's an important technique that you should want to learn that Seagull does quite often in this stream. It's like a turret engage. You could do this with a Orb turret as well, but if you have the time to do this, you can set up your sentries all on top of each other, all three stacked together, and then put the teleporter on them, and after the teleporter materializes, you can jump into it, and your sentries come with, which is a real scary way to get yourself into battle. Not only do you just pounce out of nowhere, getting behind the enemy with a devastating right-click burst damage attack, but you also have the sentries there to slow down, disorient, and add a little bit extra DPS. Keep in mind, those sentries stay in the battle until they're destroyed, so even if your telly goes away, they'll still be there, kind of holding down the fort, adding more value to your presence on the battlefield. It's a really good tactic. You should try to do it quite often. And this, in essence, is the Symmetra combo that you want to learn to try to get her maximum burst damage output. Place your sentries, cast your teleporter, start charging up that ult fire, jump out of the teleporter like a birthday cake, surprise, charge shot ready, and sentries there. Mixed with a melee, this is going to kill a squishy character quite easily. And you're going to want to practice the tempo of doing this. Now, her last ability, her ultimate, it can be difficult to know whether it's going to be a useful shield or not. So you have to kind of be careful with this one, because if you misplace it, it very quickly can be a wasted ultimate entirely. Ideally, you want to use it to block off a line of sight that's going to be relevant to the battle, to deny the opponent's vision on your team, and also give your team a bit of a security blanket to retreat under while in a battle. If you're used to playing characters like Orisa or Winston who place down a static barrier, there's a sort of barrier footsie game that you can do in Overwatch where you kind of dip in and out of the barrier, kind of luring the enemy to come attack you. And you could do that same thing with the new barrier ultimate. So when you're placing these, I'd say you should probably focus on making sure not to put it too far towards the enemy team, because if they easily can just walk past it to get into the engagement anyway, it's going to be a waste. And if you had to choose directly in the center of the entire fight or a bit more towards your team, I think either of those is good, but as it's not really going to get destroyed with any amount of speed unless the enemy has an EMP, to stay on the safe side, you always can favor it a bit towards your team, especially if you're on defense, because at the very least you'll like stabilize Gandalf style, you shall not pass, force them to come figure it out. I think the ultimate's going to be most effective whenever you can make a very set engagement. What I mean by that is if everyone's spread out in a big arena, all split up all over the place, it isn't very good. But on assault maps or hybrid maps, especially the first point before you unlock the payload, the engagement distances are usually kind of tight and direct without a ton of flanking routes, and as long as the map is made that way, you're going to get the most out of the wall, because you can use it to just freely go wherever you want if you're using it on an attack, or entirely cut off a big percentage of the enemy's ranged characters as they try to set up a push. Remember, when you're playing on defense, especially when you have a respawn advantage, maybe the enemy wants to take a key piece of high ground to shoot down on you as you are trying to come retake. Well, you can section off all of the vision that they have and sort of turtle back as your respawns come through, forcing the enemy to come down at a point if they want to kill you, because again, they're not killing that barrier in any kind of time. So with all this being said, I don't think she has the weakest ultimate, but it also is fairly difficult to use reliably. You sort of have to think about where the enemy's resources are set up and where they'll be throughout this fight, getting max value, and sometimes that's not completely obvious, but I think if you use these rules of thumb, you'll at least get some value out of it, remembering, of course, it is going to hurt ranged characters way more than it's going to hurt characters that are fine zipping in and out and around them in close range. Melee goes through the barrier like always, and mobility will surpass it anyway. Well, with all that being said, that covers all areas of Symmetra's kit. Remember, everybody, to Symmetra responsibly. Never Symmetra and drive. Of course, be very careful. Symmetra is a gateway hero, and often the challenging playstyle can allure you onto more dangerous and destructive one-trick paths, like trying to one-trick Doomfist or Torp, for example. So have fun, everybody, and remember, friends don't let friends one-trick Symmetra. I know Seagull did it, it ranked, but you're probably going to tick a lot of people off if you're trying to force these tactics all the time. Remember the Overwatch slogan, play nice, play fair. But hey, with the new LFG tool, I'm sure many of you could label your groups as Symmetra troll cheese comps, and lots of people would want to join. Even in quick play, it's a ton of fun. So hey, have a great time. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave it a like. It really does help us out and lets us know that you're enjoying the content. And if you and if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe, because we upload each and every day, so you're going to want to hit the bell icon so that you get notified when our videos go live. Link in the description is our Twitter, where we tweet out news, updates, and dank memes. That's been it for me. I've been FREEDO for your Overwatch. I'll see you guys next time.